Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Kat Bohannon, who is the author of this new book called Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution. Welcome, Kat.
Hi.
Well, I'm thinking the book probably should have been titled Eves, right?
Of course, yeah.
Right, you're talking about all of these different progenitors, right? These ancestors, first mothers of humans, tracking each of the different, distinctive attributes of who we are as people, and in particular as female people, right? And these are all different various branchings of the tree. And the first one, of course, is the one which made us mammals, right? And I just was actually overhearing a conversation the other day with someone who was talking to another person who actually, we were actually out on the ocean and there were these whales, and someone was surprised to find out that they were breastfed, right? And the other person said, well, that's what it means to be a mammal. And I think 90% of the
yeah,
right. I think
it's
90% of the people, 90% of the people who are tossing around the term mammal don't actually appreciate where it comes from. But look, I think the point of the book is to not just talk about what makes women distinct from men, but also what makes kind of humans distinct from other creatures. And a lot of that, of course, is driven by the distinct needs of maternity and of, raising children in the way that we do. So maybe the first question would be, how did you get into this topic? Because I know your graduate work was about history of narratives and so forth.
Not so much history, unless you go deep evolutionary history. I was interested in how the brain deals with, aesthetics. I was doing cognition of aesthetics. I was doing computational experiments and how the brain deals with art. But specifically, I was interested in event segmentation, and I was interested in how emotion influences memory. And so I was just really dealing with brains and stories. And that's what we know, that stories are a good mnemonic. They help us remember stuff. We don't actually have very good models for why, or even just basic mechanisms for why. We have some larger schema in cognitive psychology that are usually have to do with what the story's about. But aboutness is actually a pretty higher order level of cognition. I was interested in some baseline stuff, just event perception and how that intersects with what we pay attention to. And what we know about real-time perception otherwise. That's a very academic way of saying, I was doing something totally different than this book. But what I was doing, which did help prepare me for the book, was I was doing deeply interdisciplinary stuff. Like on my PhD committee at Columbia, I had people from literature, people from psychology, a neuro guy, and a computer science person was also an advisor. And I was writing a whole bunch of computer programs to help me parse things. So in that way, I was used to walking into another person's office in a different department and sitting down and saying, okay, I've read all of these things. Now, please immediately tell me everything I'm getting wrong so that I can improve it and get some things right, because here are the experiments I'm trying to do. You know what I mean? So interdisciplinary work is really all about willing humility. Just willing to be shamed, just willing to get on out there and not be the smartest person in the room because you're at sea, and then do that synthesis work across disciplines, which is also a translation work, right? Oh, I have a deep knowledge in this other thing that you don't have. Let me quickly translate that in a way that's not patronizing or overly skimming, so that we can just get on that same page and dig into what really matters, which are these questions, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of what I had to do in Eve is just in a dozen different disciplines, just being like, okay. Because what I discovered over in neuro is that, we weren't really thinking about what matters when it comes to sex differences in biology. Actually, most of the time we were either assuming it didn't matter or assuming that we already knew how it mattered, so it didn't matter to pursue it further. right?
Or even that it's taboo to talk about it.
Well, it's taboo to talk about in some spaces. I would say more in psych and social psych, it's more taboo than it is in a place like I'm dealing with rats. Like that's not
Yeah, right.
nobody nobody cares if your male rat is having one or another memory effect unless you're specifically, you know what I mean? Um, so since I grew up in a psych lab, my dad was a cognitive psychologist. Like I helped prep his slides. That was my puberty. There was no hope for me socially. That meant that like I was used to there being a ton of female subjects. There's no such thing as the male norm. There's sexism, but there was no male norm because the majority of their subjects are their undergrads. And man, there's a lot of chicks in psych. Like that is not a thing from the 70s forward. So many female subjects, right? So since I wasn't an animal gal, dad wasn't a rat guy. Like he was down at Emory, so he did scan the papers coming out of the Yerkes. Primate research facility. But he wasn't a person running his own animal studies. That meant that I grew up thinking that all of biology was just looking at sex differences and that just like psych did, and that was my silo. You know what I mean? That was my little beautiful bubble of like, this is not a problem. And then I wandered over to neuro and oh my God, it's such a problem. We're only studying males so often. It's only just starting to get changed, And so like Eve in so many ways was just it's like a giant thought experiment, right? Like, okay, what if we do take this seriously? What if we say, what if sex differences do matter? What does the current science say about where they might and what that might implicate? And how does that change the story of evolution, Because like the big story, like you say, of mammalian evolution is reproduction. I mean, it's cool that some little bit of a quasi-reptilian jaw like broke off and now we have like inner ear bones, but like that's not a really interesting story in evolution. You know what I mean? Like, no, sorry to all of my hearing people. I know you're really into that. I give you some props in chapter 4, but like, you know, that's not the deep story of mammals. The deep story of mammals is reproductive investment.
Yeah, and what's crazy is that humans are probably the only creatures around that need culture in order to reproduce. I mean, people talk about how what makes humans distinctive is culture, and culture helps us to build skyscrapers and to kill mastodons. But I mean, we couldn't even have babies if we didn't have culture, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be an annoying academic in that way that all people with PhDs are like, yes, but let me put a pin in that and say not exactly. Okay. Every social mammal has culture. Primates have culture and they pass it down intergenerationally. And so it's not the case that our culture is this thing that's been invented wholesale, whole cloth by our species in the hominin line. No, 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 no. Baboons have hella culture and they differ troop to troop. And so do chimps and so do many things. Hell, even like naked mole rats have culture. Like, okay. So, like, what I think I hear you saying is that the weird thing about us is that we kind of suck at making babies compared to other primates, and that we're definitely less good at it just as a species. I don't mean individually. Some people are great at making babies, okay? Some female bodies are just like popping them out and like, actually, it's still hard for her. Let's not underestimate the pain she goes through. But, like there are always outliers. But as a species, we struggle with this. This is a thing that is harder for us than your average chimpanzee, baboon, other major primate, right? And you're totally right that we need to help each other then go through these difficult pregnancies and births and postpartum recoveries, which are totally longer and harder and more challenging than they are for other primates. And that's weird about us. That's super weird. And what's weird to me is how few people really acknowledge that in evolutionary biology and in evo-focused, paleoanthropology, that actually this is a huge thing in our species. Sarah Hrdy did amazing work talking about alloparenting and what happens after the birth, that our babies are needy, that our babies can't even hold up their stupid heads for a while. Like that's an intensive thing that we do to keep those babies alive. But the thing is that even before even before that baby's born, an intensive thing has been happening because our pregnancies and our births actually are really buggy and really intensive. And so I decided, okay, well, what implications does that have? Do that, like what's going on there? How does that change our story? And it changed it kind of a lot. It really put the female right at the center of how we're still here.
Yeah, and gynecology, I mean, is probably one of the earliest sciences that we've had, right? I mean, perhaps the earliest science that we've had.
It's hard to say what a science is to like a Homo erectus exactly.
Right. Sure.
Like it's hard to say what science is before we even started calling it, uh, it, anything in the 18th and 17th century. It's like what we did have are
Or I
these
guess
like,
culturally transmitted techne, let's call it.
yes, and which baboons and chimps also have. They pass on how to do stuff with rocks. But what we do have are these medicinal practices and cultural norms around intervening on fertility, right? That we intervene on our fertility as a species. Every culture does it. Sometimes we upregulate it. We try and make us have more babies than we might otherwise have. Sometimes we downregulate it and say we're having babies in these specific contexts at these specific ages in these specific ways. Either way, the central goal is better survival. Either way, the central goal is also more social cohesion because it does both. Whenever you have a cultural practice, you're also building social cohesion if everyone shares those practices, if everyone shares those norms, whether you're a baboon or a human, right? So in that way, one of the big things we're doing as a species is like rejiggering human reproduction kind of all the time, whether that be through sexist norms about access to female bodies or whether that be through gynecology, like let's have chicks not bleed to death. I'm into it. They've been into it. I think we've been into it for millions of years.
Well, look, I mean, evolution is all about solving these trade-offs. And so, why is it that it's so hard for humans to give birth? I mean, what's the benefit of making it so hard?
Short answer is we don't know. Longer answer is here are some things we do know. Okay, some things we do know. Our placenta is really invasive, more deeply invasive than in many species. So a placenta, for those of you listening who don't know, that's where your umbilical cord attaches to the uterus. It's like your
Yeah,
fleshy.
this is where I like to say your kids are your frenemies, right? They're trying to kill you at the same time as
They're killing
you
you in a
know,
loving, fleshy way. It's complicated.
uh,
Yeah, exactly. So, okay. So the uterus is an organ. It's also an environment. It's a microenvironment. And there's limited resources that are mostly controlled by the mother's body. If you are a pregnant person, you are the one who's breathing and eating and peeing and going about the business of being alive with a body. But meanwhile, you have this, what's called a partial allograft, which is a semi-related bit of flesh that turns into a person called your baby, eventually called your baby, right? Embryo, then fetus. Okay, once it attaches, once that placenta starts building on that uterine wall and that umbilical cord is attached to that growing new body, right? That new body is long evolved to get as many resources as it can. It's hard to build a whole new skeleton inside your belly, okay? It's like, gimme, 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 gimme. Meanwhile, the mother's body is longer evolved to survive, to not die, to not have all of its
yeah,
metabolism
you'd like to be
completely,
around maybe to have some other kids, right?
or just to be around. Just the
Yeah,
survival drive is really strong, right? That there's this idea that's actually controversial in biology that actually a reproductive drive and a survival drive can very much be in conflict, right? And not simply in the broad philosophical sense, but in the moment. In the actual
right.
moment, you can, in one body, especially, and that is mammalian reproduction, have that conflict between trying to survive, trying not to die, seems reasonable, and, the fetus trying to survive, trying not to die, and then both being like, let's, perpetuate these genes, so
Yeah,
to
because
speak. None of
the
it's
interests,
conscious, of course, but yeah.
because the interests of your child, they're not entirely aligned with the interest of the mother, right?
Well, any parent of young children will deep in their gut agree with that. But like, yep, that's a kid that is not really pursuing good things for both of us right now. But even while pregnant, that's actually very, very much true. So, okay, so that means you have a conflict of resources in the uterus, right? You have what we now call maternal fetal conflict, right? And what you want then is a pregnancy that lasts just long enough to kill neither body, including getting it out of you, right? So the thing that we do know with our deeply invasive placentas, like some placentas, like a mouse placenta, it's like a shallow little teacup dish, like it just kind of pops off when she gives birth. It's not a big deal. For ours, which have placentas that penetrate all the way into the mother's bloodstream with these blood vessels that are really entangled in one another and just really, that means that to get that thing out when you give birth, the so-called afterbirth, well, that involves a lot of tearing, actually. That detachment is not simple, in fact. And in fact, what causes a lot of maternal complications, a lot of maternal mortality is bleeding, right? A failure to clot up those blood vessels, and then you just have an active internal bleed and you bleed out. Super fun, super awesome. If you're a pregnant person, don't worry, go to your prenatal appointments. You'll be fine. Medicine's amazing. But you have to think about it like, oh, in mammalian reproduction, you can have more or less risk to the mother. We have a high risk profile as a mammal, right? We have a lot of risk. So that's one of the things we know for why our pregnancies and births are so difficult. Because, of course, as soon as you have a greedy fetus, you also have major knock-on effects in the maternal immune system, because that fetus has to downregulate her immune system to not attack it all the time. Right.
Yeah, you talked about malaria and how it loves to feed on pregnant moms, right?
Malaria loves to survive like any infectious agent, but that plasmodium has a thing where it snags. It has a little thing where it kind of snags into small blood vessels. That's part of why malaria does so much damage in anybody, male, female, baby, elderly, whatever, right? But what placentas have is a lot of small blood vessels. And so what the plasmodium can do, whether it evolved to adaptively or not, we don't know. What it can do is sneak on into that placenta, hang out and hide, as it were, on the fetal side, or at least within the placental blood vessels, and effectively evade the mother's immune system. So that means that someone who in a place where malaria is endemic, can go and get a test for malaria, get your blood test, right? And come back negative, as in you don't have malaria, you don't have active malaria, but actually you've got that plasmodium hanging out in the placenta, evading both the mother's immune system and clinical tests for malaria. She doesn't receive treatment. She ends up having a resurgence as it goes through its life cycle. And she is much more vulnerable than in her postpartum time, in her breastfeeding time, even during her pregnancy, for really bad kinds of malaria. And in fact, of the kinds of malaria that are really bad, pregnant people and postpartum people get it a lot worse and are far more likely to die of it, right? So that means that from an epidemic point of view, from a public health point of view, from an infectious disease point of view, simply reducing the number of placentas per square mile would greatly improve how impacted that community is by that thing. So that's one of those things where it's like, okay, once you start asking questions about the female, you start getting different angles on the question, right? What if birth control, which is to say providing choice, not emphasizing it, not some horrific eugenics thing, but just like making available female choice to communities that struggle with malaria, how can that then be a tool to fight malaria, right? It's a different way of thinking about the problem as soon as you put that female body right in the picture. And you only get there by thinking about, oh, pregnancy's not a walk in the park. Actually, it affects just about anything for a body that goes through it.
Well, it used to be hazardous to your health, right? I mean, what do we know about the mortality rates of childbearing in our evolutionary past?
Well, we don't have a time machine. Well, there are things we do know. So I started with, okay, here's what we do know after saying we don't know, okay? We know that there's an obstetric dilemma. We know that we're trying to squeeze a watermelon-sized thing out of a lemon-sized hole, which is not great, just mechanically. It's not great. It's a difficult thing to do. But how did we get there? Well, we know that we had encephalization. We know our heads got bigger along that hominin line. You can see it. You can line up the fossils. You can see our heads getting bigger, stupidly bigger as our brains grew compared to our body size. Meanwhile, you can also do an analyses of our pelvic opening. It's called the pelvic inlet should be called the pelvic outlet. It's the bony hole between your hip bones that a baby comes out of if you're a person that gives birth. Okay, well, so if that hole's getting smaller and the thing coming out of it is getting bigger, that's not great. That's not a great evolutionary trajectory. That's not awesome for you. But the way to make it more real is to simply compare our current birth scenario to creatures most like us. So, an average first-time human mom will take about 12 to 16 hours to give birth. That's top to bottom, go into labor and result in baby. Hopefully not death, hopefully baby. Cool. All
But
right.
is that with modern medical
That's
assistance, or is
that
that
is
standard
what
across?
that is with modern medical assistance, but you should know that like that's going to be on average whether you're a person giving birth in a hospital or not, right? Because if you're giving birth in a hospital, you're more closely monitored, but it does turn out that actually even an epidural doesn't greatly lengthen the time it takes for you to push. This is one of those myths that was around for a while, that somehow having an epidural makes you spend longer in labor.
Yeah, I thought the epidural then required the use of Pitocin, and then they balanced each other out.
Turns out, no. So Pitocin is there to bring on contractions. That's called a triggered labor or an induced labor, and it helps make that uterus contract. But the epidural doesn't affect whether or not your uterus is contracting. No, no, no. In fact, you almost will never have an epidural until you've already begun your contractions, right? So that's a separate thing. No, the epidural is simply blocking, it's a nerve block below a certain segment of your spine that is preventing your brain from experiencing what your lower body is doing. Now, it also means your brain can't do things like tell your legs to move, but your uterus is contracting anyway. It doesn't affect your contractions. But there was a fear for a while that if you couldn't consciously control your pushing, then that must mean that, it's going to take longer to give birth. Well, actually, no. It turns out you can pull back some of that, give you more of an ability to push, like I did. And does it lengthen your labor and pushing? On average, about 15 minutes max, which is not a, yeah. Yeah. So we're talking like 12 to 16 hours of some of the most intense pain you've ever experienced, followed by a birth, which is even more so, or about 15 minutes more. So no. That's not. But it has been used as a kind of fear-mongering thing around epidurals. Like, oh, you're going to spend longer. Oh, why can't you just grin and bear it? Why don't you push through? But actually, no, female pain matters. Anyway, I'm going to come back off of that high horse and go back to what's up. No, so what's up with the pushing is that your body is trying to get a thing out of you. Yeah, that's what the pushing is for. Trying to get it out of you so that you and baby don't die. Yep, because if you spend too long in that, it's twofold. It's not simply that the baby might suffocate as the, umbilical cord gets compressed or what have you. It's also the reason you're going into labor is your body's reached a metabolic threshold, which is to say this pregnancy is now too costly to continue for your ongoing and the baby's ongoing health. That's why you're given birth. That's why you're given birth when you are.
Now, if we were quadrupeds, presumably we could kind of keep them inside until they were capable of, jumping out and walking around and, doing their thing. Like horses just plop out and then they start running away, right?
Well, giraffes famously drop 6 feet from the laboring mother's uterus because she doesn't get all the way down. She just kind of spreads her big giraffe legs, which is, can I just say, giraffes are hilariously the stupidest body plan I have ever seen. Okay. Anyway, so she labors 6 feet off the ground. The baby drops out of her vag, and the shock of hitting the ground is what struggles the lungs into taking its first breath.
They don't need to be smacked by the doctor.
Nope. Straight up. Yeah. Now, sometimes that baby can then break a leg and, well, that's it for that baby in the wild. But usually they're roughly fine. And, the mom kind of licks their head a little bit and then they saunter off with their giant, stupid giraffe bodies. So I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right that you would think that if it's not the case that getting it out of the body is so hard, why not just keep gestating a thing until it's ready to survive, which reduces that like caretaking profile. Actually, it's really species dependent. So, for example, a mouse gives birth to a thing that looks like it should still be on the inside. Okay. They call them pinkies for a reason. The fur hasn't grown, the eyes haven't opened, the ears haven't unrolled. In fact, mouse pups can't even urinate and defecate without stimulation. So, if the mom doesn't lick the belly at regular intervals, they'll just hold in their pee and then die of nitrous waste. Like, this is not a body that is ready for the world. But in their evolutionary path, and this is true of, I think, all mice, the need to go and forage for food, the need to go and be done with gestation, the need to have the pup stay there while the mom recovers, for whatever reason, whatever accidental evolutionary reason, has produced giving birth to effectively pretty, what would look to us like real preemie pups, right? But most mice are burrowing. They're all nest builders, but most are also burrowing, which is to say they kind of create the semi-protected nest space where those little pups can be. The mouse mom can come and go to get water or whatever the hell she needs in her species specific pattern, right? And that works out for them. So
Yeah.
actually, this idea of when do you invest? Do you invest while you're pregnant? Do you invest later on with lactation? Do you invest later on with extended caretaking? Is really a moving target. It's really flexible. What I can say is that a first-time human mom, 12 to 16 hours top to bottom for baby, and a first-time chimp mom or later-time chimp mom, on average, it's about 30 minutes. It's not, and I'm talking like labor to baby. She just like knuckle walks off. That's what she's dealing with. There are longer chimpanzee labors that have been observed. What they don't know is if those are the ones going through complications or are more average. It's also hard to observe chimps in labor because they do it up in trees at night, is the
Yeah, I
thing.
think you mentioned
Yeah.
just a few cases where primates were observed helping other primates to give
So
birth, but it's
rare.
very rare. Yeah.
So rare. We're the only species that we know of that regularly, species wide, with very few exceptions, helps each other give birth. It's an incredibly vulnerable moment for the birthing body. It's a vulnerable moment for the newborn. So there's a lot of social trust there. There's a lot of accepting the presence of others there, which for a lot of species is not going to work out because there's a lot of infanticide in chimpanzees, for example. So that's a trust condition that those cultures don't regularly have. They can. That's not to say it's impossible, but it's not been greatly observed in the wild. Usually, what chimpanzees do is what a lot of primatologists in the field will call a maternity leave. They literally leave the main area of the troop to go give birth on their own, typically, and then carefully, slowly come back with their newborn at sometimes a great time later and introduce that newborn to the troop, which is a dangerous moment for both mother and child.
Yeah, I think it's remarkable how little infanticide you see with humans, right? Because I mean,
Nowadays,
infanticide, you see it in almost all mammals. I mean, there's just a few, I guess bonobos don't do it, but it seems like it's a fairly common thing.
I think it's true that bonobos do it, just rare, super rarely observed. Let's assume that like there's always outliers, but is it the norm for them?
Yeah.
Is it the norm for chimpanzees? Well, not every second of the day, but I think any chimp person's going to say, yeah, that's a thing for them. That's a thing. A
But
lot
it's
of dead
also
kids.
it's also not just the males. I mean, I think
That's right.
people know about how males will, kill all the infants of the, that were sired by the previous male and so forth. But you cite cases where there are females that will engage in infanticide of other females' offspring, right?
Yeah. So chimps go to war a lot. It's a weird metaphor because what they do in conflict is not exactly the same as what we now call war, but whatever. They have conflict between territories and they'll raid other troops' territories and they'll attack one another and, bad stuff goes down. What is true is that we know about chimps killing the nursing offspring of other troops' kids, and we also know from an evolutionary perspective, well, that makes the nursing moms go into estrus sooner. It makes them fertile sooner. So there's an argument for like if you kill the kid of some other dude that Well, that means that you can then make a new baby with that one, and that perpetuates your genes faster. We see this in a lot of other species. We see this in horses, especially. Actually, stallions are hella dangerous. If there's been a horsey coup and there's a new stallion, he is very likely to kill some foals that weren't sired by him. Not cool. Not cool. Not something
Well,
you want to have happen.
and some of the females will spontaneously abort in
Yes.
anticipation of infanticide, right?
Yes. So this is a big thing. This is called the Bruce effect. Not some guy named Bruce, but the last name of the person who discovered it. So there are a lot of species that have these kind of male coups, topple the king, as it were. And you mostly see it in places that have more selective breeding, more harem-based breeding, where you have a dominant male that is more likely to be the one to sire with a bunch of females in his group. That doesn't mean he's in charge, but it means that he's the one who's got the best chances of siring. So if a new male comes in charge, well, the females that are currently pregnant are incredibly likely then to abort their fetus up to a certain point of pregnancy. If they're too far along in pregnancy, they'll still give birth. But the main argument for this is that, well, why invest in this pregnancy if this dude's just gonna kill them when they come out? That's a lot of material. That's a lot of bodily investment in this pregnancy. And you see it in mice, you see it in rats, you also see it in geladas, which is a social primate. I think it's over 80% of the females that are currently pregnant after a coup like that will spontaneously abort. And it does improve their reproductive chances. The ones who do are far more likely to go and be pregnant by the new guy sooner than the ones that didn't. So that's the kind of idea. Now, what's interesting about human beings is we don't have that. We don't have anything like the Bruce effect. So that's one good argument for how probably our reproductive history was not King Solomon and his many wives. Probably, at least it's one possible argument against it. We probably weren't male-dominated, harem-based reproductive primates to the degree that, like, a coup would drive a miscarriage rate. We don't have that at all.
Well, look, we've moved very quickly into human social behavior, but I thought maybe we'd backtrack
Yeah.
because I thought some of the analogies that you made were really fantastic, like the idea that the womb is both kind of an egg and a nest, right? And it's a very distinctive choice. I mean, we could presumably have been, marsupials, right? We could presumably have laid eggs. There's
Which
lots
is still
of
the
different
more
ways to do it.
reasonable choice to make, ladies. I would
Yeah.
love to sit on a clutch of eggs. That whole labor thing, that sucked. Come on. I mean, all praise to people who like being in labor, but nah. Happy to never do that again. Did that twice, love my kids, but no. Right? No, I would love to lay an egg. Unfortunately, it seems that we're mammals, and we're the sort of mammals that don't lay eggs anymore. And so here we are, we have live birth.
So what's the advantage of, carrying this thing around rather than just sticking it on the ground?
Again, short answer, we don't know. Here's what we do know. Of the species that have live birth, it's a convergent trait, mostly mammals, but we do have some sharks, we do have some lizards, we do have a few other creatures in the world that give birth to live young. Of all of these creatures, we do see some temperature advantage in gestation when you have a live fetus in your uterus instead of laying an egg externally. Like sharks that are pregnant, for example, that give birth to live young, will often then go swim in warmer waters while they are gestating. Like, in other words, you can control the temperature of gestation a little bit better in your body than you by moving around than if you just leave it in a nest. Nest builders will do lots of things to control gestational temperature. They'll pile on leaves. You've seen birds do that. They'll literally brood. They'll sit on the damn things to try and make it more body temperature. They'll do all kinds of things to our eggs. But simply leaving it in your body is one good way. That's a way that you can control for fluctuating temperature, which can affect the development of a fetus. Another thing you can do is you can keep those eggs a bit safer. Man, there's a lot of things that eat eggs. We do. We eat a lot of eggs,
Right.
right? Things used to eat our eggs too before we started keeping them on the inside, right? So if you're leaving your offspring effectively in an egg, in a nest and leaving,
Yeah.
well, that's a vulnerable thing. That's a vulnerable moment. So
Well,
that's another like risk control basically by
so portability is another feature, right? So,
basic
our humans,
portability. Basic
yeah.
portability, absolutely. Basic portability and basic protection across that gestational span. But again, it comes at a cost. You are now making your own body, again, by accident, we're talking about evolution, but you're making your own body a combo burrow slash nest and eggshell, right? Because now if you have a placenta, and that means your body is deeply connected with your baby. You are breathing for that thing. You're controlling its respiration. You are the waste control. Your kidneys are in charge. Your liver is in charge, right? Your basic immune system is in charge of filtering for and controlling infection. There's a good advantage there in that, like, if your immune system's already fighting infections in you, well, now you're doing it for the baby too. You don't have to worry about if it's getting through the eggshell, right? But all of this is a thing. Also, the metabolic costs, the sheer damn energy it takes to grow a body over time is not small for any species, but for some species, a lot more than others, right? So it's like these are these trade offs. These are these trade offs. Yeah, you get more portability, you get different kinds of protection, you get lots of things that seem cool if you're gestating internally. And then here are all of the costs to the mother's body.
Now, maybe we can talk about some of the things, some of the downstream consequences of the unique needs of gestation and child rearing, because it seems to impact almost everything, right? Your sight, your hearing, your sense of smell. I mean,
Yeah.
your behaviors, your moods. I mean, there seem to be a number of sex differences
Yes.
that some of which we're aware of and some of which we're completely unaware of. Like, for instance, that one about the sound, I had to go to YouTube to find, this, what is it, 16.7
Yeah,
megahertz.
yeah.
I didn't hear a
Of
thing.
course not.
I was doubting whether there was anything there. I was like, wait a second, is there actually something here? Or is this just a
I
joke?
think it's 17.7. Yeah. So that's in the perception chapter, y'all, of Eve. So once upon a time, not that long ago, upstart little startup actually company invented an alarm in the UK, and it would blast a really obnoxious noise, but at a very high pitch that supposedly only young people could hear, because starting at around age 25 or so, human beings start losing the upper registers of our hearing. It's normal
So
aging,
you
normal
could put this
senescence.
you could put this in the parking lot of the 7-Eleven, right? To get rid of the
Exactly.
kids.
So the idea is like you don't want kids hanging out being annoying, which is ageist, but whatever. This is their business model, right? You don't want loitering teens or something. Anyway, so you could blast this thing out and your older customers aren't going to hear it at all, won't even be bothered, but young people will find it very disturbing and not want to be around it. Well, it was unintentionally sexist because it turns out mostly men start losing their hearing. And by men, I mean cisgender men. I mean,
Yeah.
your Y chromosome, typical male. Okay. Around age 25 or so, you're losing that top end of your hearing, those higher hertz, but you don't need a hearing aid yet, not till you get older. Do get one when you need one. It seems to stave off dementia, but you don't need it yet, probably. Okay. So, but that meant that, like, yeah, you don't hear the alarm, but women hear it for a lot longer. So your average 30-year-old woman could hear that thing just fine. So when I was writing, no, the alarm was called the mosquito because it was the high-pitched whine, right? I went online and I found the pitch that it was supposed to be, and it was the most obnoxious thing that I had ever heard. But I can sadly say that when I wrote the book, that was true. But now I am in my 40s since the book has come out, and I have now lost my ability to hear that. So I guess I could be around it. But yeah, there's an aging measure. But yeah, no, it's absolutely true that women keep our higher pitches for much longer in life than men do, on average.
It would be great to have an alarm clock with that sound. So, if you have a couple where one, member of the relationship, maybe the male wants to sleep in.
Darling, that is
could...
called children. You don't need special technology for that. My kid wakes me up at 6:30 every morning, and no matter where I sleep in the house, in the guest room, attic, anywhere, I could be in the car, he will find me and does not care to find my husband. So that's built in. That's built in. That isn't always true in every couple that has a male and a female, but yeah, anyway.
Now,
So,
presumably this is because you are, as a woman, um, you know, specifically interested in hearing the distress call of a child, right?
this is the evolutionary argument, which is fairly compelling, but it isn't the only argument. So, the evolutionary argument that a lot of people will make for it, and I talk about in the book, is that, well, in most primate species, the female is the primary caregiver. And I don't just mean like primary, like in some kind of 1950s, but the guy comes home at night, like as in, chimp dads aren't doing a lot. They do some with the young in the troop. They do some teaching and caretaking. They're not just awful all the time, but they aren't foraging for food. They aren't primary caretakers in that way. And the assumption is that along our evolutionary path, though, we started doing more of what Sarah Hrdy calls alloparenting, which is to say, helping take care of one another's
Yeah.
kids, and also across sex and gender lines, like, okay, that we're all chipping in, as it were. Nevertheless, in the deep mammalian evolution of our hearing capacity, kids have higher pitched voices. Wouldn't it be good to be able to hear them if they're in distress? And so we do see, even in humans now, females seem to have the ability to hear higher pitches for longer. And even though we have basically the same capability of hearing, even when we all have all of our human hearing, say when we're 20 years old, the female ear seems a little bit more attuned. It's kind of like a tuner on your high-def stereo, a little bit more attuned to that range of pitches that do correspond with the average pitch of a baby's cries. Now, that said, it isn't necessarily true that it's always an adaptation. For example, once males start losing their hearing, is it that the female's having their hearing protected so that she can keep hearing her kids? Or is it just that y'all's bodies kind of suck and age faster generally, in many different areas of your body
Right.
plan, in your immune system, in many different areas, right? So that's just kind of a broad protection of having two X chromosomes, which is good for some things and bad for others. We also get more autoimmune diseases, right? So you always have to be careful with that adaptation argument, right? It's like, yeah, good arguments for adaptation, but also broadly, for whatever reason, your immune system and the way you stave off certain kinds of aging has sex differences. It's an issue. And why isn't that also a thing we should think about when it comes to the ears?
Mm-hmm. Well, it also applies to muscle. I mean, I was intrigued by this notion that, fast twitch and slow twitch muscles,
Yeah.
They're differentially distributed in males and females.
Yeah. Again, short answer, we don't know why, but we do know that it's true. So an interesting thing about muscle. Okay, so for those of you who aren't muscle people, your fast twitch is short, explosive movements effectively, and your slow twitch is your long, grinding endurance.
Good for punching people.
Well, it depends how quickly you want to do it. If you want to slow punch something over and over and over, you're going to use more slow twitch. Right. So the basic thing to think about it, for example, is like in your legs, you have both fast and slow twitch. But if you are a sprinter, you're going to have a lot of fast twitch. And if you're an endurance runner, like a marathoner, you're going to have a lot of slow twitch, right? Which is to say your muscles are constantly adapting for how you use them. Your skeletal muscles are just always responding to what you're doing in the world, right? That's part of why training is even possible. You can train to be one or another type of athlete. But for those of us who aren't athletes, hi, that's me. I'm not an athlete at all. I still walk. I still am lucky enough to be totally ambulatory, and I have a lot of fast and slow twitch muscle. But if you launch me into space, which I hope you'll never do, I'm slightly afraid of heights, but if you launch me into space, we know from studies on astronauts that you'll get a lot of what's called conversion. Right? A lot of our slow twitch muscles will be converted to fast twitch, in part because we're not standing up against gravity. So there's a lot of muscles. There are a lot of muscles in your body that are invisibly doing the weirdly hard work of just holding you upright. just all the time so that you don't fall down. And if you are in 0G, you're not using those. And so your body will effectively cannibalize them and or convert them to a different type that requires different sorts of energy, right? And so when astronauts come back, they have a lot of this muscular conversion. What's weird and interesting across the sexes here on Earth is that males on average have more fast twitch and females on average have more slow twitch, even in the muscles that are basically doing the same stuff, like walking across the ground. And that's something we don't really know why. We don't know if that's an X chromosome influence. We don't know if it's basically use, but that's even true in just like our spine stabilizers. Like there's just something going on in sex differences in muscle, which seems in many cases to make females a little bit better at endurance and males a little bit better at explosive strength.
Right. And you also talk about fat. I think this was at the beginning of the book,
Yep.
how there are these, different types of fat. And females have a very special type of fat,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is useful for pregnancy.
Well, it seems to be. All kinds of fat are useful for pregnancy, to be clear. It takes so much energy to be pregnant. And also, adipose tissue is doing more than just give you energy. It's also an integral part of your endocrine system, makes its own hormones. That's true in males and females. It also produces its own immune cells and immunoagents. It's a part of your immune system. So, your adipose system is now considered an organ system on its own.
Yeah.
Even on its own. We used to think it was like sort of part of your endocrine system, sort of part of your digestive system. Now it seems to be so important that it's its own thing. That's your fat organ that you're pinching when you look in the mirror, when you grab at your stomach. So try to be nicer to it. Okay, back to pregnancy. Right. So we're like one of the fattest mammals in existence. Like, especially when we're born, all those cute chubby rolls. Oh man, they are there for reasons we don't fully understand, but we're born nearly as fat as a baby seal. Like we are chubby.
I thought it was to protect us when we tried to learn how to walk.
That is a great idea, but it takes a long time to learn how to walk, and we've actually thinned out pretty well before then. We can't even hold up our damn heads, so it's been a while since we were walking anytime soon to birth. But like basically we're born and we look kind of weird for a while because newborns look like squashed fruit. But then we chub up a bit more and we get those cute little rolls, and it takes a long time before we're even crawling, right? And the best argument going for why we do that is it's a buffer against maternal milk supply. Basically, it takes so much to build baby brains and baby bodies that you better start packing it on, kid, because you don't know what's going to happen to what's coming out of mom's food, but you can't even eat food until you're 6 months or so. So you better just hoover that down as fast as you can, right? And store it. Just store a lot of it. One of the things that's really interesting is that on the maternal body, different fat depots seem to have slightly different jobs. So this stuff under my arm, this, you got your basic storage, as far as we know, this subcutaneous fat right here. But I'm not going to stand up, but if I'm grabbing at my butt now, I'm grabbing at my hips and my butt. So this gluteofemoral fat, that's your upper thighs, your hips, and your butt. Those fat deposits seem to specially store different kinds of stuff. There are these long chain fatty acids, LCPOFAs, long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. Okay, our bodies are not good at making them from different parts. We make a lot of different stuff, proteins, fats, sugars. You take in food and then your body breaks a lot of it up and makes different stuff out of it. But we're not great at making these special kinds of fats endogenously. We mostly get them from our diet and then we just store them. For females, we mostly seem to store them in our butts. We start storing them in childhood, and then we keep going. And it turns out they do seem to be really important for building baby brains and baby retinas, which by most accounts are just an extension of your brain anyway. Basically, you need these things to build really important parts of babies if you ever get them. And so there are a number of scientists that now argue that actually part of the reason we have these special fatty deposits on the female of our species, along our hips and thighs and upper butts, and guys don't have them as much, is because they're crazy important for building our overly large human brains. So it's not, does this dress make my ass look fat? It's, does this dress make me and my kids look smart? I
So
suppose.
wait, so do modern norms of thinness mean stupider children?
Modern norms of thinness mean stupider everyone because sexism.
Right, of course.
But I will say that, like, I've never met a human being that didn't modify its body, okay, whether historically, archaeologically, or presently across many different cultures. If you can change something about your body, it will be culturally normed and you will innovate on it to match or rebel against that cultural norm. So hair is a big one. We do all kinds of things to hair. We dye it, we cut it, we do all kinds of things to skin. In many different human cultures, we squished our babies' heads to make them different shapes. Don't do that, by the way. Definitely don't do that. But we did that across many human cultures in Paleolithic times, not simply in the Americas, but also in Central Asia and many other places. We found evidence of
Circumcision.
circumcision. God, I didn't do that to my child, but there are huge cultural norms to what you're going to do to a foreskin. I kind of wish it was the kids, choice in the matter, but you know what? I'm not Jewish. So whatever, cultural norms, which is to say that, like, I usually try to think about this idea of dieting and plastic surgery and a bunch of other things that women and men and intersex people do to their bodies as falling under oh, you can modify your body. Cool. You're probably going to do that because human beings have always done that and always will. It's just a little tricky when it intersects with, like, really crappier parts of sexism, which says that, like, females have to be a certain thinness or fatness to be desirable and therefore valuable,
Well,
which
foot binding.
sucks.
How about that one?
Foot binding was certainly a thing for a period in many Chinese cultures for a while there. It wasn't all of Chinese history by any stretch of the imagination, but that was a period. There are still human cultures that stretch their lips out with big discs there and ears and many other things, right? So it's sort of like, I like to try and take a step back and say all human beings modify their bodies. Let's be less judgmental about it, but also let's reduce the pressure on people to have to. That thing. That thing that kind of sucks. Okay, that was a huge, like, stump speech, but I didn't answer your question. Okay, I think it is absolutely the case that the emphasis on the pregnancy bod and the post-baby bod and the idea of bouncing back after you give birth, which is a very Instagram thing, which is a very whatever thing in many Western cultures right now, but also true in Japan, is hugely problematic because it's making a lot of pregnant people starve themselves in ways that they shouldn't. It's making a lot of postpartum people starve themselves in ways that they shouldn't. And that absolutely affects not only the health of their babies, which everybody cares about. Oh, you're shrinking your baby's brain. Oh, you're reducing the quality of your milk supply. We care about the babies, but also her own health, which also matters, right? Because people who have nutritional deficiencies when they're pregnant are more likely to get infections and have harder times recovering and clearing those infections when they get them. It affects the effectiveness of their labor. It can affect how well they clot up and not bleed out, like all the things. Baby and mom suffer more if she ain't eating right. So yeah, that is a problem.
And there's also been a huge amount of knowledge in the last couple of decades about the importance and complexity of maternal milk, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I know in my parents' generation, they were like, formula, no difference there. A little fat, a little protein, you're good to go.
Hey, we used to feed our kids gruel, okay? A lot of kids died, but not everyone. That's why we're still here. There's been a lot of different innovations, some great, some not great, around how to keep our kids alive, whether or not we're able to give them breast milk or whether or not we choose to. Okay. In fact, part of the reason milk pasteurization became such a thing in the United States wasn't simply that Louis Pasteur invented it, but actually the main thing pasteurization was used for in Europe after Pasteur was beer and wine. It was mostly keeping people alive from not having infected beer and wine. No, when we started pasteurizing milk products was in part in the United States because we used to give cow milk to our babies and cow milk products. And because they were totally run through with bacteria, our kids would die of usually diarrhea, and they died a lot. Like there was so much dying of the diarrhea because of the unpasteurized milk. Adults too, but especially our young people. And so we started pasteurizing our milk. We started heating it up to a certain degree to kill all the bacteria. And wow, that kept a lot of us alive. That was great. So my mom also fed me formula after a certain age. She has this description of starving me out. She was holding me. I don't know how old I was. Was I 6 months? Was I 8 months? I don't know. She had to go back to work, man. And so she says she held me in a rocking chair all day. It was one of those wicker rocking chairs. Remember those were fashionable in the 70s and 80s, those things? Yeah, you've probably seen them with the bent wood.
Yeah.
She was holding me in one of those things all day while I screamed and cried and refused to take a bottle until finally I was hungry enough at the end of the day that I took the stupid bottle. I was real stubborn. That hasn't changed in my personality. But I made her pay for it. But that was how she got it to work for me. And I seem to have done all right. Seem to be all right. I survived the 80s despite, I don't think I'm any dumber for it, as far as I know.
What I found fascinating wasn't just simply the complexity of the milk and the prebiotics and so forth, which people were skeptical about, the colostrum and so forth.
Yeah.
But it's also how it is, calibrated and
the
precision engineered based on the signals and the communication back and forth in real time.
So this is something I first learned from Katie Hind, who used to run the primate lactation lab up at Harvard. She's now in Arizona, I believe, in the way that many people go through Harvard and then depart. So she's great. She is a primate milk expert and is very clever. I think she now runs Mammal March Madness or something like that. Anyway, so this is called the UPSUCK, UPSUCK, and it's been demonstrated in a number of different species in various ways. Basically, there's a principle of physics that we forget in suckling, right? That when you have a nipple, when you have a teat, what you do, whatever species you are, is you're forming a docking seal around that nipple, and you're forming a vacuum in your mouth. And as you move the tongue and as you suck, because you're not just the whole time, you're actually doing swallow, and so forth, is you're actually moving the focus of a vacuum back and forth within an enclosed space of that mouth. So that creates a tide that effectively is not just triggering that mammary tissue to start making milk, right? Because it's not just a bucket of milk you're making all the time, but you're triggering that letdown reflex. Okay. But it's also sucking some milk in, but then in the bottom of every tide, there is an undertow. It's like a wave function that way. And so the undertow is actually sucking your saliva, the baby's saliva, back into the mother's teat, where it then distributes throughout her tissue and seems to be read by all kinds of different sensors and immunorespondents that change the milk profile to suit. So if the kid is sick, the milk changes. The ratio of proteins to fats changes. It definitely upregulates immunocontent in general. It does a bunch of different stuff, and also adds different sorts of hormones like cortisol and so on and so forth, all of which seems to help make the baby better at fighting an infection and helping the baby calm in order to get enough rest while that body is fighting that infection.
And also, I think the awareness of the stressfulness of the environment is transmitted in that way, right? So the cortisol levels then have downstream lifelong consequences for how they respond to stressors in their environment, right?
Right. So we have to think of lactation then as this kind of two-way communication platform between the maternal body and the offspring's body, right? So whether that kid's getting stressed and there's more cortisol in its saliva, or whether the mother's experiencing a stressful environment, and then that they are effectively biochemically communicating that to one another through that bidirectional transfer point of the damn nipple, which is one, incredibly cool. There's nothing like that in the animal world. Two, okay, so then we have to think of lactation as a thing that's more than simple caretaking. It's actually a major foundational thing that happens in mammals that have nipples. right? That is shaping that body over time, the offspring's body, to respond to a certain kind of environment, right? So that's where you're seeing some of those epigenetic changes in development. So that's where you're seeing a bunch of different things, including personality. Right? That if you have slightly more cortisol in the mother's milk, then you end up having an offspring in some species. Now, we have mixed evidence in humans, but we know this in some other species. An offspring that is less risk taking, that's a little more fearful, a little more self protective. And the opposite is also true. A little less cortisol, and you see more risk takers. And that's a thing, right? So, and that's going to maintain throughout that offspring's lifespan, right? Which is interesting that these
Presumably it's
early,
epigenetic, right?
yes, presumably it must be. It's not like the kid's thinking about it. We're talking about mammals. Come on now. These are non-human animals. So this is something that is shaping that brain development as well as the rest of the body's development from those early moments of exposure, right? So that's really, really cool. And there are a lot of lactation scientists that are kind of digging in, like, what are the boundaries of this? What's good? What's bad? What is optimal? How does that parse across many species? But it's just one of those interesting ways where when you stop assuming that just because it's female, it's unimportant, you start to find really cool new research directions.
Hmm. Well, let's get from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, right? Where you talk about sort of the origins of patriarchy, right? And so presumably there's a lot of evidence that, we at one point were matrilineal, right? And perhaps matriarchal. And then there was a shift that happened. And I think, you make the point that sexism, loosely defined, was evolutionarily adaptive, right, to some degree at some point. I mean, obviously it depends on how you define this, but
Definitions are super important here. Yep.
yeah, but I mean, what happened to cause that flip?
Well, okay. So let's define our terms a little bit because it really seems to matter. What do we mean sexism here? What did I mean sexism in that last chapter? I don't mean simply like if you're at work and you're coming into a boardroom and you have a higher profile job in your organization and some dude assumes you're there to serve the coffee. Like that's a level of sexism. That's just your basic jerk behavior, basic assumption of gender roles, just kind of stuff nobody's benefiting from that except for maybe that dude who gets to feel a little more important or something, I guess. I've never been that dude, but right? So when you think about a lot of what we call sexism from an evolutionary perspective, though, there are these sex rules and there are these gender norms
that regulating sexual behavior, basically.
That specifically have to do with regulating sexual behavior and child rearing behavior. And by that, I mean things that regulate access to female bodies. There is nothing in your DNA that codes for how long your damn skirt is. That is a cultural norm. It differs across history, across many different cultures, even presently. Ain't nothing in there about that. However,
but jealousy is pretty hardwired, right? And male jealousy is pretty darn hardwired.
Female jealousy then too, by extension. So what I mean to say is we seem to, in every human culture, create rules that regulate access to female bodies one way or another. We may have a subset of rules that are more liberal, that's distinct to our culture. We may have a set of rules that are more what we would call conservative or more controlling, right? That is distinct to our culture. It just depends which culture you're in. What we do all have is these damn rules. We have rules that determine what is okay and what isn't in terms of how much of a female body can be seen and by whom. Where can that body go and at what ages, and to fraternize with whom. I said that weird, fraternize. That's hard to say. Anyway, with whom and what ages. And by the time you actually get to actual sexing, so many rules, some of which are great and some of which are less great. And of course, with the actual baby making, right? So what is true of our species is that we make rules that control access to female bodies. And then whether they're more liberal or more controlling, we care about those rules in deep, identity ways, deep, this is my culture ways. Yeah.
And I think the key is that, even if every position of authority was in the hands of women, would still have these rules, right?
Totally.
It has nothing to
Totally.
do with who's in charge, right? It's a there's going to be these rules.
Which is to say, part of our deep human culture making is making these sex rules. And if from a biologist's point of view, what these do is they create local norms around reproduction. They're innovating around female fertility, either making her reproduction more profligate, more under her control, or less so, right? They're regulating with whom and when she has sex, and with whom and when she has babies, and how the whole cultural apparatus surrounds such a thing, right? And if you go then back to deep time and you say, okay, these are bodies that actually have difficulty with reproduction. These human bodies are challenged more so than other primates. We can still have perfectly healthy pregnancies, perfectly healthy births. I'm just saying, in general, species wide, this is challenging for us. Well, now you can see gynecology and this kind of sexism, these sex rules around access to female bodies, as two sides of the same coin, right? They're both behavioral innovations that regulate our fertility in local cultural ways, right? On the one hand, you have a building body of medical practices and knowledge that's passed down through generations that helps female bodies innovate on their fertility and survive it better, put it more under her decision space, more under her control. And on the other hand, you also have cultural norms that are regulating how often she's getting knocked up, right? And under what circumstances. I'm going to assume, and I did in the last chapter, that in the deep, deep history of the hominin line, I don't know when these two things got started, but assume that they went hand in hand for a long time, right? In deep time, assume they probably worked together a lot of times, right? The central outcome for that culture to survive and thrive was fewer females and offspring dying. Just that, just less with the dying of the babies and the mothers. And that would make a group better survive and thrive, and therefore that culture survive and thrive as well. However, I can say with some authority that modern gynecology, in not simply Western medical practices, even other medical practices as well, by and large has vastly surpassed the usefulness of nearly all sexism at keeping maternal bodies and offspring alive and less sick and less vulnerable, right? In fact, most of the time, the kind of sexism we're talking about works directly against the miraculous advantages of all human gynecology. It makes
So it's a mismatch.
it
It's a
now it is a
mismatch.
mismatch. Before, I
Yeah.
think it probably was not, or at least it sometimes was, but our species is 300,000 years old, and hominins even older than that. So if some cultures tried some super anti-female policies and it killed a bunch of people off, well, that didn't work, did it? So it's like, so once you have that deep time perspective, it's not hard to see that the more female supportive policies are probably going to be the ones that win out. The more female supportive policies that keep more females alive and more offspring alive are probably going to be the ones that perpetuate both the species and that group. But we get caught up in these cultural norms of the present. And we think that what it is now is what it must always have been, right? But I think it's safe to say, even in the micro environment, the micro window of time that is what the United States right now, that we are definitely in a sexually regressive period. We are definitely in a pushback against feminism and women's rights. We are definitely in a time when things ain't great, but that's a small window. That's a really small window. It's horrible, and our present suffering matters, and we should alleviate suffering in all spaces, and we should push back against sexism, of course, but don't lose that deep time perspective. This has
Yeah.
never been a winning ploy.
But it is interesting that now we're in a place where we have done a lot to solve the problem of childhood mortality, of
You would think.
pregnancy mortality, and yet, we're having fewer children than ever before, right? So it's interesting.
One of the
But
strongest drivers for how many children a woman will have, well, the first one is how many kids did her mom have? It's just that, which is probably a combination of a locally perceived norm, like it's normal to do what my mom did, which is a psychological thing. That's a choice space. That's a norming space. It's also a genetic thing. How fertile was my mom? How fertile am I likely to be? So it's a combination of nature, nurture, it's culture and body, you know, going on there. The next strongest driver, of course, is how likely is it my baby's going to die? Which is to say, what is the childhood mortality age 5 and under? Um, and in fact, the strongest predictor of how likely you're how likely you are to have fewer kids than your grandmother, not your mother, but your grandmother, is how likely were your mom's kids to survive, right? So we've seen that it's harder to see that demographically across something like the United States, but it's easier to see it when we've implemented policies and made medicine available in places where you used to have a really high childhood mortality rate. And then you get those vaccines. So there's some places in sub-Saharan Africa, there's some places in Central Asia where it's like you had a really high childhood mortality rate. And then, hey, vaccines, antibiotics, awesomeness, awesomeness, it's like da, 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 da. And then it goes down. And you see women having fewer children in a way that is strongly predicted by how many children survived to age 5, right? So unfortunately, right now, the HHS is in the United States is doing the best possible thing to increase the likelihood that we'll have more children in subsequent generations, because they are doing just about everything in their power to make more kids die under age 5. That's the main thing they're doing. They're reducing access to vaccines. They're discouraging use of vaccines. They are making it more difficult to raise children if you are poor. They are making it more difficult to access both childhood care and maternal care if you lack money, which is going to make more kids die. So our grandkids may indeed have their fertility rate go up for the worst possible reason.
Well, Kat, look, there's so much more that we could discuss in this book. You have a whole chapter on the, quote, female brain.
Oh, yes.
You have
Wow,
a whole discussion on monogamy, right? And what we know about monogamy in the past. There's a lot of fascinating information in here, the best of interdisciplinary work. So thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Eve, check it out.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.